and this voice together in this space. It's such a great blessing. Thank you. As many of you may know, on this Shabbat, we read Parshat Beshalach. This is called Shabbat Shirah, the Shabbat of song, because the Israelites cross the sea and sing. I was really struck by a verse that I had never paid any attention to in this week's Torah portion, Vayehafech levav paro. Before I explain what that means, I want to give you a little bit of context. Pharaoh keeps saying that he's going to let the Israelites go, then he changes his mind, the 10 plagues. And we hear that his heart is hardened by God. Generally, we get a word used for the hardening throughout these parshiot that explain how we get the plagues with something that means heavy. Vayichabed, kaved, heavy. Pharaoh's heart is heavy. And each time the offer to leave is rescinded, God responds with plagues. We get a cool Seder. You know how this works, right? But now, this week, Pharaoh is watching the Israelites leave Egypt and cross the Red Sea. They're actually exiting. And we get this strange and important statement that I will say again. Vayehafech levav paro. The heart of Pharaoh is turned inside out, upside down. He's confused. He's human. In modern Hebrew, we hear the expression a lot, lehefech, quite the opposite. That's that same word, vayihafech, lehefech. Quite the opposite. It's heard around in Israel if you walk around. Hear people disagreeing. Pharaoh's heart is flip-flopping somehow. It's inside out, the opposite. It's the opposite of what it was. In Israel, some of you may have ordered in a cafe hafuch, the same word, hafuch, hefech, lehefech. You can hear the word, the same root. It's an upside-down coffee with layers of coffee and milk out of order. So if you order a cafe hafuch, you get something with multiple layers. It's the same word that's used for Pharaoh's heart. It's just out of order. Maybe he's not sure what he thinks or what he feels. For the first time ever, I had a bit of empathy for Pharaoh. In this topsy-turvy world of ours, I feel like I know a little bit how he might have felt. A lot of things feel upside down to me too, and probably to you. And when things are upside down, it feels hard to get orientation. Don't know what's up and what's down. For 489 days, we've been upside down, unable to process what happened on October 7th. Right now, we're in the so-called phase 1 of this ceasefire. On January 19th, with overwhelming excitement, joy, and gratitude, we welcome back to Israel the first of the hostages released in this phase. Such a moment of exaltation, and yet anguishing to think of those in captivity. How would they be released, and when? How would they be able to return to life? Joy, exuberance, excitement at the return of the first hostages. Gratitude? Hostages taken from their living rooms. How about fury, anger, horror, and gratitude, of course? And celebration? Where was the world to decry this horror? How could we be forced to wait over 400 days for the return of these innocent civilians? On January 19th, as we waited with hope and trepidation and a million other emotions, the Pardes Institute of Jewish Studies, a liberal yeshiva in Jerusalem, put out this message. Today, we at Pardes, along with the entire world, await the safe and swift return of our hostages with impatience and hope. In this moment of intense anticipation, we are holding the memories of our precious students, Marla Bennett, Zichrona Livracha, and Ben Blutstein, Zichrono Livracha, in our hearts. The planned release of the terrorist who was responsible for their murder, together with 7 others at Hebrew University in 2002, weighs on us tremendously today. For the first hostages released in this phase, the murderer of Ben and Marla was released. Marla and Ben were cherished members of our community. The statement went on to say, and their tragic absence continues to be deeply felt to this day. We look to our traditional sources for wisdom on navigating the bewildering mix of dreams and nightmares we live in today, where wedding celebrations and funeral processions unfold simultaneously. And they shared a verse from Kohelet, which I read at a funeral this morning. A time to weep and a time to laugh, a time to mourn and a time to dance. In this unique and gut-wrenching moment, the email concluded, when the seasons of our joy and our anguish are not distinct, but instead overlap so completely, we pray for uplifting news and offer our tefillot and support to those who need them most. Heart-wrenching, the release of the first 3 hostages and the release of a known and convicted murderer. In one of my favorite poems by one of my favorite poets, Yehuda Amichai, he comments on these words of Kohelet. The poem is called "A Man Doesn't Have Time in His Life." A man doesn't have time in his life to have time for everything. He doesn't have seasons enough to have a season for every purpose. Ecclesiastes was wrong about that. A man needs to love and to hate at the same moment, to laugh and cry with the same eyes, with the same hands to throw stones and to gather them, to make love in war and war in love, and to hate and forgive and remember and forget, to arrange and confuse, to eat and to digest what history takes years and years to do. On January 19th, I thought of the death of Sarah Duker in 1996, 29 years ago, next week. Sarah was my suite mate at Columbia in the Hebrew suite. It was 1 year after our graduation from college, where we had lived together. We knew so many people in common. Matt Eisenfeld was a student of Talmud and the roommate of Rabbi Shai Held, who spoke at our Wolf lecture in November. Together, they were killed when the number 18 bus blew up in Jerusalem. Some months before their murder, Alyssa Flatto, who was 20 years old, from West Orange, New Jersey, was killed in Israel as well. The New York Times reported that, quote, a suicide bomber drove his explosives-laden car into a bus in which she was riding in the Gaza Strip. The Associated Press said Ms. Flatto and Ms. Duker both went to Frisch Yeshiva High School in Paramus. And then a few years before that were the 4 bombings on Ben Yehuda Street in 1997-98, my first year of rabbinical school when I lived in Jerusalem. On January 19th, as we waited with so much hope for the return of 3 of our beloved hostages taken with such brutality and violence, we prepared to release the murderer of Marla Bennett and Ben Blutstein. Why? 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 How could we forgive? How could we allow this? And how could we not bring home our hostages? Rabbi Eli Confer, a young rabbi in New York, co-founder of Hadar, wrote that since October 7th, we have been looking to our sources for any wisdom we can glean in this very difficult time. One prayer he explains that has had much resonance is called Achenu. It's not very well known in the Jewish community. At its core, the prayer is a request for God to have mercy on captives and free them, taking them from narrowness to expanse, and from darkness to light, and from oppression to redemption. The prayer calls us to attention, saying we need to focus on this issue. The request is a simple one. God, please bring home the captives. Just as our ancestors were redeemed from Egypt, may they journey from darkness to light right now. This prayer reads in English, our family, the whole house of Israel who are in distress or in captivity, who stand either in the sea or on dry land, may the Omnipresent have mercy on them and take them out from narrowness to expanse and from darkness to light and from oppression to redemption, now swiftly and soon. Our ancestors stood in the Red Sea and looked back. With fear and trepidation in this week's Torah portion, Pharaoh and his army come up behind them. The Torah says the Israelites were leaving triumphantly, and then Pharaoh drew himself nearer. The Israelites looked up and caught sight of the Egyptians advancing at their rear. They became very frightened. The Israelites cried out. Joy and fear mixed all together at that moment in the Red Sea, as it is for us today. That moment of triumph became one of fear. Moses raised his staff and the waters parted. The Israelites entered the sea, but on dry land. The Egyptians pursued the Israelites, and when their chariots were in the middle of the sea, the waters closed, and they drowned. The Torah says, but the Israelites had walked on dry land in the midst of the sea, the water forming a wall for them on their right and on their left. Thus on that day, God rescued Israel from Egypt. Israel saw the Egyptians lying dead on the seashore. And this moment of triumph became one mixed with grief, too. Our world is moving so quickly right now. It's bombarding us with information and with emotion. It is impossible to stop long enough to assess. What can we possibly feel as we see photos of Gaza in rubble? Horrible, horrible images of terrorists further terrorizing hostages walking through a hostile and hateful crowd. How can we see the yellow ribbons in the braids of young women supporting their fellow hostages? How can we imagine a single moment of the life of newly freed Yarden Bibas as we await some information on the fate of his wife and 2 young children who were stolen from us? How can we without falling apart entirely? Tuesday night, we had 2 speakers here, Hamza Awoudi and Yitzhak Goldberger, a Palestinian and an Israeli peace activist. Last Friday, I warned you that it might be upsetting, whatever they said, because I had no idea what they would say. And Tuesday, when we gathered, some of you told me we were expecting them to be radical and to turn things upside down. But in fact, what they said was that we need to see each other. We need to make peace with our enemies, not our friends. That didn't even sound radical. We are so numb. Our tradition has a prayer that specifically thanks God for freeing hostages. It comes from the daily morning liturgy, the blessings we traditionally say each day as Jews. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech ha'olam matir asurim. Blessed are you, Adonai, who frees the captive. Every day we say this. But it never meant anything real. At least it didn't seem like it. Captives? When? Where? In ancient times? The anguish of our current situation is not unique in our history. And the remembrance of the pain of having hostages has been a part of being Jewish since the time of the Israelites walking to safety through the Red Sea. Like our ancestors, we are complex and living in a complicated world. We celebrate and mourn together somehow. We pray for the healing of other human beings, even as we can't imagine their lives, even when we're not completely convinced of their humanity. We find sympathy and empathy within ourselves in tiny amounts, even in the darkest moments, because we are human and we strive to see the humanity in others. In the moments after the Israelites crossed through the sea, relieved and joyful, they were confronted with the trauma of seeing their pursuers drowning. What must they have thought? With an upside-down heart, lev hafuch, they had to go on. They had to continue the journey, to go forward, to continue so that we could be here. I asked Hamze and Itzik in the dialogue on Tuesday night, how do we ever stop seeing these images that haunt us from the TV, that prevent us from seeing clearly and seeing the humanity in the other? These images that turn our hearts upside down in confusion. They both agreed. We look to a future for our people separately and together. How will the hostages build new lives? How will the pain subside? How will we celebrate the return of more hostages as the dread builds within us, not knowing the fate of so many? I think Yehuda Amichai was right in his poem. A man needs to love and to hate at the same moment, to laugh and cry with the same eyes, with the same hands to throw stones and to gather them, to make love in war and war in love, and to hate and forgive and remember and forget, to arrange and confuse, to eat and to digest what history takes years and years to do. We are right in the middle of the sea. Like our ancestors, there is no choice but to go forward, out of Mitzrayim, out of the narrow place, and to a new beginning. Shabbat Shalom.